news analysis segment, we're going to take a look at welfare's war on drugs and the fact that it always fails. Always fails. This is some reporting from InTheseTimes.com. Just codifies some of the research that we've already put together on this show numerous times. First of all, the Indiana Senate Health Committee last week approved a bill that would mandate drug testing for welfare recipients. Those who test positive for drugs will be required to enter a treatment program at their own expense in order to continue receiving benefits. Because if you're poor enough to get on welfare, you've got the money for a rehab you don't need. That just doesn't make any sense to me. But the reason behind this, folks, is because back in the Clinton administration, 1996, Bill Clinton got a lot of pressure from the right wing about welfare. And, you know, this was back in the 90s, you know, it was all about Democrats going to give away money to the poor, just going to give away to, you know, freeloaders and the Cadillac queens and so on. And so with that pressure, he had this welfare to work programs that were, you know, a pretty decent program for a Republican. Yeah, I know he's a Democrat. It's a joke, folks. The act that he signed was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996. And what it does is it sets up a way for states to be able to deal with temporary assistance for needy families. And it provides a framework that allows the states to, quote, may require drug tests for welfare recipients and may penalize those who fail such tests, and implements a lifelong ban on TANF benefits for individuals convicted of a drug-related felony. Because, you know, if you were caught growing a pot plant, you shouldn't ever get food stamps ever again. You should just starve in the street because you grew a pot plant. You got a felony. Your kids are poor. Your kids are poor and they need some, you know, assistance. You can't afford groceries for the kids. Sorry, you grew a pot plant once in your life. So no more assistance for you. Yeah, Christian nation. Anyway, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, at least 7 states, including Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Missouri, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Utah, have already passed legislation regulating drug tests for applicants to public assistance programs. And as of March, they say at least 28 states have proposed legislation that would require welfare recipients to take a drug test. Now, the way this is sold, this is often sold in a frame from a conservative standpoint, but it's one that I think even people on a progressive side might bite on. And that is this idea that, well, if they're not working and we're working so hard to make this money to give to them as welfare, by God, they shouldn't be spending it on drugs. By God, they should be out there getting work and feeding their kids, and they shouldn't be spending it on drugs. Of course, we don't stop them from spending it on alcohol, tobacco, but nevertheless, we shouldn't be allowing these welfare bums to be using their money for drugs. And that's kind of an interesting sentiment, right? You know, that once someone is poor and you're going to give them charity, you then have the right to control their behavior, you know, kind of an indentured servitude, if you will. But laying that aside for a moment, let's just put the moral stuff to the side for a moment and take a look at the actual effectiveness. If the real idea behind this welfare drug testing stuff is to make sure that we're not having a bunch of drug addicts soaking up the public dole and spending on drugs, and we're doing so in order to help our state save money, let's see if it's really worked. In Arizona, they had this program where they wanted to drug test people for their welfare their welfare assistance, and they were going to reimburse them $30 if the test comes back negative, right? Because remember, the welfare recipient has to pay for this test out of their own pocket to get welfare because, you know, they're poor and they can afford to do such things. So they spend their $30 to get to pay for their drug test, and then they get that reimbursed back to them on their first check if they turn out negative. Well, sure enough, most people turn out negative and they have to pay back that $30. Of the roughly 87,000 people tested in Arizona from 2009 to 2012, do you hazard a guess as to how many of them came back positive? One positive out of 87,000 people who applied for welfare benefits. You got one positive. Now, a lot of people will say, well, hold on, Russ, you can't really measure that because how many of those people who would have gotten welfare didn't apply for it because there was a drug test, right? We might have saved some money that way. Well, they took a look at that as well. The Arizona's Department of Economic Security originally projected a $1.7 million savings per year. 1.7 million a year that we would save in cash assistance by not giving welfare to the drug addicts, right? The people that fail the drug test, right? Projected 1.7 million. But by 2012, the state had saved $560. That's the $560 they saved on the one guy who failed the drug test. Now, you also want to figure in the 1,600 people who refused to turn in the drug test, right? There's your savings of the people who didn't take the drug test because, we wouldn't give them welfare. Even if you figure that in, it's $200,000. So we've saved around $200,560. In the meantime, shelling out $200 million in welfare benefits. So there's no savings to be found there. And this is not an isolated case, people. You look at the case of Florida. They had a drug test law in place for 4 months, and then it was struck down by a federal judge. And the reason why is because, even though people are poor, they still have a Fourth Amendment right. You still have to have a reasonable suspicion, a reasonable cause to, a probable cause to search their bodies, to take their fluids. And just being poor isn't reasonable suspicion that you're committing a crime. But nevertheless, we do have 4 months worth of data. And in that 4 months, the state of Florida tested about 4,000 temporary assistance for needy family applicants. Of those 4,000, 108 turned positive. That's a 2.6% positive rate. And roughly 2,000 applicants who failed to take the test at all. Florida spent $118,000 reimbursing those who tested negative, a net loss of $46,000, and more than would have been paid out in benefits to those who had failed the test in the first place. So, yeah, sure, you might want to punish people or try to have some sort of moral game to determine whether or not they deserve to get their welfare, but what cost do you want to spend on that? It's costing more to deliver that moral message, don't do drugs or you don't get your welfare, than it would be if we just gave them the welfare in the first place. And of course, folks, don't forget that all of this stuff predicates on the fact that they're getting busted for marijuana, the drug that tests positive. As we saw in that New Zealand story, 70% of the drug tests that are positive are for pot. Are we really worried about people on welfare on pot? Meth, coke, and heroin, maybe. Pot, not a big deal.
Have you ever met that funny?
Oh, by the way, we have a tradition here at 20 After. So I hope you're all ready to join us.
Mandatory.
It's a union rule,
If he said